Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to be getting into the Pacific Theater today as we continue on with World War II. So, primarily dealing with the Japanese and the United States. And so, we're looking at kind of two major turning points here in the war, looking at the Battle of Okinawa and the dropping of the atomic bombs. All right, specifically, we're going to focus on the atomic bombs today. So, let's take a look. All right. So the war had been going on for quite a while. Everything kicks off because of the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. All right, so the Japanese had been kind of planning this surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, which is where the U.S. Pacific Fleet had been stationed. And on December 7th, 1941, they attack Pearl Harbor. Now you can see all the battleships here. This is battleship row. They were all lined up because the United States intelligence had heard that there might be some kind of attempt to sabotage the ships. All right. We did not realize that there would be an all-out attack on Pearl Harbor. And so the ships were lined up like this to prevent sabotage. Unfortunately, it made a very good target as they came in and bombed the ships. And so after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the headlines the next day said Japan starts war on the United States. So that's actually an extra paper from December 7th, 1941. And then the next day in Congress, Franklin Delano Roosevelt gives the speech talking about urging Congress to declare war on Japan and head into World War I, talking about the day which will live in infamy. Now, the United States had been fighting for quite a while. All right, this battle went on for a long time in the Pacific Theater, and the United States kind of worked their way across the Pacific Ocean, hitting kind of different islands and doing a strategy called island hopping, hitting strategic islands across the Pacific so they could kind of make their way to Japan. And they were bloody, bloody battles that were fought all throughout the Pacific Theater. And so the United States had finally worked their way all across the Pacific Ocean and basically had Japan on their heels at this point. And so the United States had a really important choice to make now that they had pushed Japan essentially all the way back to mainland Japan. They could either invade the island of Japan itself, right, the main islands of Japan, or they could try to get Japan to unconditionally surrender. All right. Now, in order to stop and save countless lives through an invasion, they decided to opt for unconditional surrender from Japan. And so these decisions they made basically looked for a couple of aspects. Again, they were trying to stop or prevent the loss of thousands of lives if you were to actually try to invade the island. And so they issued a number of demands to the Empire of Japan, and then Japan returned with conditions. All right. And so the United States wanted an unconditional surrender, meaning Japan could not be granted any conditions. Japan's one condition they wanted was that the emperor be able to stay in power. All right. And so the United States said, no, that's not exactly what we're looking for. We want unconditional surrender. And so in order to save American lives, they still opted to not invade, but they decided to persuade the Japanese to surrender in a different way. And that is by using a brand new weapon to try to get them to surrender. So on August 6th, 1945, at 8:16 a.m., the world was changed forever as the United States opted to use this brand new weapon in order to urge Japan to surrender. The city of Hiroshima. All right, the city was essentially destroyed as the United States used the first ever atomic bomb. All right, you can see that the vague outline of a car right there, a couple cars, but the city was basically destroyed. All right, now keep in mind, this was a civilian city. Yes, there were military installations there, but they took out the entire city. All right, the Japanese didn't surrender. So 3 days later, on August 9th, 1945, at 11:02 a.m., the city of Nagasaki. Again, The city was virtually destroyed. Very few things left standing, especially at Ground Zero. The Shinto arch there, actually one of the few things that was left standing there, which is kind of a religious symbol to the people of Japan. Casualties. So when we look at the populations of these cities, between 255,000 and 195,000 respectively here, you can see the number of people who died basically instantly, the number of people who were then injured, and then total casualties here, everything with injuries and deaths all together. All right, now keep in mind, if you're injured, it's very possible that you would have died later because of nuclear poisoning, right, or radiation basically poisoning. Here's your distance from Ground Zero. The closer you got to Ground Zero, you can see a good number of deaths. Then you kind of move back, and then you get into a larger number of deaths again and injuries. Basically, we're talking about if you're at Ground Zero, those people who are killed are basically vaporized. They're just gone. They cease to exist. All right. As you get further out, you get more injuries and burns and things from fire and explosion than you do other aspects. So that's why you get to a large number of people being killed and injured at 3,300 to 4,900 feet. The causes of immediate death, they set the bombs off differently in these two locations, and they are slightly different bombs as well. You can see in Hiroshima, the first one, there was a good number of people who died because of burns, and then obviously falling debris. When you look at Nagasaki, they actually detonated that bomb in the air and let the explosion go down into the ground, and so much more of the city was burned to a crisp, in addition to people dying of other things as well. So you can see it doesn't equal 100%, because it's very possible that they died of multiple things happening to them at the same time, right, in Nagasaki. And so the question that we have for today, guys, is was the United States justified in dropping, the atomic bombs on Japan? You are going to go through and fill out the pros and the cons of this activity today. And so that's what your goal is right now, is to basically fill in your document with the T-chart. What are the pros? What are the advantages? And what are the cons? What are the disadvantages to the dropping of the atomic bombs? We're going to start with the pros. So when we look at the pros, a couple things that we can put in there right away. You can just write down the main bullet point there on your T-chart. But they decided to attack rather than test the bomb. And the reason for that is they were a couple of reasons. Number one, they were worried that it's very possible that the bomb didn't work. And so if they tested it and that was broadcast to the people of Japan and it didn't work, that would clearly not convince them to surrender, right? That would be an issue. The other issue that they ran into with testing versus actually using it on Japan itself was the militaristic hold that the military had over the people. They could go in and they could just black out anything that happened, any test footage that was being sent to the Japanese people or the media could just be turned off or blacked out by the military or the government. All right, and so they worried that would happen. Another one that we have is the Japanese willingness to die. In this battle, in this war that had been being fought, many of the Japanese soldiers knew that it was far better for them to die in battle than it was to surrender. That's what their mentality was. And so this goes all the way back to the idea of the samurai, right? That they would perform ritual suicide, the harakiri or the seppuku in battle, basically to stop from being dishonored, right, from defeat. And so they knew that this was still kind of the mentality of a lot of the Japanese soldiers at this time. They were also using things like the kamikaze attacks with the aircraft as well, where they were basically suicide airplane pilots. They would crash into something. And so they knew that this was something that was part of the cultural idea of their military, and they wanted to stop the number of people from dying. Another one here we have is they believe it saved both U.S. and Japanese lives. Right, the kamikaze attacks were costing heavy casualties against the United States naval ships and the Marine ships. The Army and Marines had lost more than 50,000 men simply because of these kamikaze attacks. And they knew that if they were to invade the island, that kind of ramping up the idea of the willingness of the soldiers to die for their fight and some of the other attacks that they've seen, that the casualties would be very, very high. One last pro that we have here is looking at the diplomatic aspect of using the atomic bomb. All right. So again, put in the main bullet point there. Basically, the United States, some of the pro aspect of this or the advantages, the United States used the bombs so that they could better control the Soviet Union after World War II. Yes, the Soviets were our allies during the war, but we knew that ideologically we just don't mesh up very well. And we knew that they were kind of going to be the next enemy that we might have to face. And so the United States wanted to keep the Soviets out of the Pacific theater. The Soviets were set to enter the Pacific theater not too long after the bombs were dropped, and they wanted to make sure that the Soviet Union was not involved in the recreation of Japan after the war at all. All right. And so it also, they believe, would show the Soviets the power that we have from our new weapons and keep them manageable on a diplomatic aspect. So not looking even at winning the war necessarily, but trying to keep a future enemy manageable in future diplomatic concerns. So we look at the kind of wrap up here, that we have for our pros is there's an author here, his name's John Connor, and it says it was impossible in August of 1945 to predict the awesome shadow that the bomb would cast on humanity. And when we look at it overall, it comes down to this. After everything is all said and done, the atomic bomb did exactly what it was designed to do. It was designed to end World War II, and that's what it did. It ended World War II. Now shift over to the other side of your T chart there, and let's look at our cons or our disadvantages. All right, when we check out our cons, there's a number of them again. We'll put them up there. I want you to write down the, the bullet point. All right. You might want to add a little bit more to the first bullet point there. I should change that around. But before Hiroshima, the Japanese were searching for a way to surrender. And the con for us using the atomic bomb is the Japanese didn't understand how to surrender to us. They were trying to get in touch with the United States through diplomatic means. They were even trying to get in touch through the Soviets. They did not know how to do so. And so they were trying, some people would say that the disadvantage to using it was that they actually were trying to surrender. Okay. Another one here, the Japanese actually didn't even understand the surrendering terms. All right. Remember that we talked earlier that the United States basically said, we want unconditional surrender. But then the Japanese came back and said they didn't want their emperor to be removed from the throne. Well, that's a condition. And so the Japanese didn't quite understand that the United States was looking for unconditional surrender. And so that clarification of the surrender terms would have helped to prevent the use of the atomic bomb as well. Finally, using the bomb to show power. And we use this as an advantage and a pro, but this is also a con, right? They talk about the idea that the power that this bomb would have on future diplomatic events, right? We talked about how it could keep the Soviets manageable in the future and just kind of show off the power of the United States. In fact, Secretary of State Burns at the time said, us possessing and demonstrating the bomb would make Russia more manageable. All right. Now, again, it was designed to end the war, but they took this beyond that. And this is why this is a con. They were using it to show other possible enemies how powerful we had become. Right? It was not something that should have been used on the Japanese people then. The last con we have right here, we look at the attack of the Red Army, right? The Red Army or the Soviets were set, and I mentioned this before, they were set to enter World War II in the Pacific. And the Soviets were ready to mobilize and enter the war in the Pacific. The British and the United States knew that the Japanese were fearful of having to fight against the Soviet army at this point. And so despite that fear the Japanese had, the United States felt it was important to keep the Soviets out of the Pacific theater altogether. They were worried that the attack by the Soviets would be met by very little force by the Japanese, and they would lead to the surrender then of the Japanese forces. But again, this comes back to a diplomatic thing. We did not want the Soviets involved in the peace terms in the Pacific. And so that is why they used the bomb. That's what this is saying here. So that's the con aspect or the disadvantage side of it. So lastly, kind of wrapping up here when we look at the cons, another historian here, he is quoted by saying, there exists overwhelming historical evidence that President Harry S. Truman knew he could almost certainly end World War II without using the atomic bomb. All right, so during the war, obviously, and we haven't mentioned a lot, but Franklin Delano Roosevelt passes away, and so President Truman is the one that ends up taking over. He ends up ending the war. But there is evidence that supports that they didn't need to use it to end the war. And so we look at down below, it says, with surrender looming, General Dwight D. Eisenhower stated that he was, quote, appalled that the bomb would be used in these circumstances. He also urged the president at the time not to drop the bomb, all right, that it was not necessary to get them to surrender. So that leaves us here. All right. You guys have heard both sides of this argument now. And so your task right now, guys, is to answer the question right here. Was the United States justified in dropping the atomic bombs on Japan? I want you to write a 1-paragraph answer to that question, and you need to use at least 3 details to support the opinion you've come up with. You have to have an opinion of yes, we were justified, or no, we weren't justified, not a maybe. You can't straddle the fence here. All right, yes or no, and you need to use the pros or the cons that support your opinion. All right, so do a great job, guys. If you have any questions, as always, get in touch with your teacher, and we will see you again soon.